My name is Martha Green. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked behind the scenes, roles where outcomes matter more than recognition. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't posture. I don't dramatize. I've learned to observe first, speak later, and act only when I'm sure. People usually assume that means I'm agreeable, replaceable, easy to overlook. If you'd met me during the years the story takes place, you might have described me as dependable, quiet, maybe even a little invisible. The kind of person managers rely on without thinking too much about it. The kind of employee whose name isn't mentioned in meetings unless something breaks, and even then, only briefly. That's not a complaint, it's an observation. Because being underestimated has a strange side effect. People stop guarding their words around you. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, cinematic way. There are no raised voices, no slammed doors, no viral walkout moment. What happened unfolded slowly, almost politely, and yet it changed everything. At its center is a single sentence my boss said to me one afternoon, casually, without malice. You're replaceable. He said it the way people state facts they believe are obvious. He said it with confidence, and he said it assuming it would pass through me and disappear. But words don't always leave when they're supposed to. Some of them linger longer than expected. What followed wasn't an argument. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a quiet internal shift, a recalibration of how I understood my position, my value, and my responsibility to myself. From the outside, nothing seemed to change at first. I kept showing up. I kept doing my work. I kept my tone neutral and my posture calm. Inside, something had already moved. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through how small dismissals become normalized, how silence can be mistaken for weakness, and how preparation often looks exactly like compliance until the moment it doesn't. I'll talk about patience, not the kind that waits to be rewarded, but the kind that observes, documents, and chooses its timing carefully. There's no villain here in the cartoon sense, just people operating on assumptions that went unchallenged for too long, and one decision that couldn't be undone once it was made. I'm telling this story now, not to dramatize the past, but to be honest about it. Honest about how easily we accept the roles we're assigned. Honest about how power shifts when someone quietly steps out of a frame others assumed would always hold. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized that the moment someone stopped seeing your value was the moment you started seeing it clearly yourself? Before anyone told me I was replaceable, they showed me, slowly, indirectly, without ever saying the word. At work, I was known as reliable. That was the label most often attached to my name. Not brilliant, not strategic, reliable. The kind of person who responds to emails before being reminded. The kind who noticed inconsistencies in reports and fixed them quietly, without flagging the error unless it affected a client. I was the person people CC'd when they wanted something handled, not discussed. In meetings, I usually sat slightly off center, close enough to hear everything, far enough that no one looked at me when decisions were being framed. My contributions were rarely disputed, but they were also rarely attributed. Someone else would restate what I had said 5 minutes earlier, and the room would nod as if hearing it for the first time. I learned early that pointing this out only made things awkward. So I didn't. To them, I was a stabilizer, a background system that kept running. They didn't think of me as someone with upward momentum or alternative options. I wasn't being groomed or tested. I was being used in the most neutral sense of the word, like infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it works, is invisible. My boss liked to describe our team as lean. What he meant was that everyone carried more than their title suggested. In my case, that meant I knew how to do parts of 3 roles unofficially. When someone was out, their responsibilities slid toward me without discussion. When a process needed patching, I patched it. When a client relationship needed smoothing, I handled it quietly and moved on. No one asked if I wanted more. No one asked if I wanted less. That silence created an illusion that I was content exactly where I was. And maybe, at one point, I was. There's a comfort in being needed without being scrutinized. You're spared ambition politics. You're spared rivalry. You're spared the constant performance of importance. But there's a cost. When you're seen as steady rather than significant, people stop imagining your absence. They talk about growth and restructuring as if you're a fixed object in the room, like a wall that will always be there, holding things up. I noticed how conversations shifted when I entered late. Not paused, shifted, as if my presence didn't require recalibration. I noticed how my calendar was filled with tasks, but not with invitations. I noticed how praise was delivered privately, almost apologetically, while criticism, when it came, was casual and public. None of this was dramatic enough to protest. That's how it survives. I told myself I was being professional, mature, above ego. I told myself that visibility wasn't the same as value, and I believed that, mostly because it was easier than asking what my value actually was in their eyes. The truth is, I made it easy for them not to look too closely at me. I didn't demand context. I didn't insist on credit. I didn't remind anyone how much institutional knowledge I carried, how many decisions quietly passed through my hands before becoming final. I thought consistency would eventually speak for itself. But consistency, without boundaries, gets reclassified. It becomes an expectation. By the time the story truly began, they had already decided who I was to them. Not consciously, not maliciously, but decisively. I was the person who would absorb pressure without redirecting it. The person who would stay late without mentioning it. The person who would adapt. In other words, I was useful. And usefulness, when mistaken for identity, can erase the rest of you. I didn't resent them for it. Not yet. At that stage, I was still operating under the assumption that being indispensable and being valued were the same thing. I hadn't yet learned how often one replaces the other. What I didn't realize then was that they weren't just underestimating me. They were finalizing a story about me, one I had never agreed to tell. The first moment didn't arrive with weight. That's why it stayed. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blurs into every other workday if you don't mark it. We were in a small conference room with glass walls that never quite muffled sound. A routine project review. No tension, no raised voices, just updates moving around the table in a predictable rhythm. When it was my turn, I outlined a risk I'd noticed in one of our client deliverables. It wasn't urgent yet, but it would be. I explained the pattern calmly, offered a workaround, and flagged the timeline. I'd done this many times before. My boss listened, nodded once, then moved on. A few minutes later, someone else, less familiar with the project, repeated my concern almost word for word. This time, my boss leaned forward. "That's a good catch," he said. "We should definitely keep an eye on that." No one looked at me. No one corrected the record. The meeting continued. I felt something tighten briefly, then release. A small internal adjustment. I told myself it didn't matter. That credit wasn't the point. The outcome was what counted. That was the first cut. It didn't bleed. It didn't interrupt anything. It simply introduced the idea that my voice was interchangeable with anyone else's, as long as the information landed. Later that week, my boss forwarded an email chain where a senior leader praised how smoothly a complex transition had gone. I had designed the transition plan, documented every step, and personally trained 2 departments on it. The forwarded message had one line from him at the top: team effort, no names, no context. Again, I told myself it was fine. Leaders are busy. Praise is shared. Ego has no place here. But my body remembered before my mind did. I started noticing how often my contributions were absorbed into the process. How often my work was referenced without reference to me. How frequently I was asked to explain how something functioned, but never invited to help decide whether it should function that way at all. It wasn't hostility. That's important. There was no malice in his tone, no intent to diminish. That's what made it easy for everyone else to ignore, and for me to question my own reaction. When I mentioned one of these moments to a colleague in passing, she shrugged lightly. "That's just how he is," she said. "You know he appreciates you." Appreciation, I was learning, can be entirely internal. The smallest cut came the day my boss said, half jokingly, "You're the glue here. Things would fall apart without you. But don't tell anyone I said that." He smiled as if it were a compliment. I smiled back. Glue doesn't get promoted. Glue doesn't get consulted. Glue gets used quietly and replaced when it dries out. I didn't have that language yet. I only felt the faint discomfort of being defined in a way that left no room to move. What struck me most wasn't the words themselves, but how easily they were said. How casually my role was summarized without my input. How confidently my value was framed as functional rather than directional. I began replaying moments in my head, not obsessively, just attentively. I noticed patterns I'd once dismissed as coincidence. How decisions happened in rooms I wasn't invited into. How outcomes I'd influenced were announced as if they'd emerged fully formed. Still, I stayed quiet. Silence, at that stage, wasn't a strategy. It was a habit, a reflex built from years of believing that patience was professionalism and that restraint would be rewarded. Everyone else ignored these moments because they were small and survivable. That's how systems train you. They teach you which discomforts are acceptable to absorb and which ones merit a response. This one, I decided, was acceptable. But it marked something. The first time you realize your presence can be edited out without consequence. Something inside you starts taking notes, even if you don't know it yet. I didn't confront him. I didn't withdraw effort. I didn't change my tone. I just began to listen more carefully. Because once a cut is made, even a small one, You become aware of where the blade came from. After the first few moments passed without consequence, they stopped feeling like moments at all. They became atmosphere. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It settles in through repetition, through things that are easy to explain away if you look at them one at a time. A missed acknowledgement here, a decision made without you there, a joke that lands slightly off, but not far enough to justify discomfort. I told myself I was being sensitive, that everyone experienced this at some point, that the real professionals didn't need to be seen. So when my workload increased without a change in title, I absorbed it. When deadlines were set, assuming my availability, I adjusted. When my boss began speaking over me in meetings, finishing my sentences as if he already knew where I was going, I let him. Each time I explained it away internally. He's under pressure. He trusts me. He knows I'll handle it. Rationalization is a powerful anesthetic. I started noticing how often I was the person smoothing things over after decisions I hadn't agreed with. A process would change abruptly, creating confusion for the team. I'd be the one fielding questions, rewriting documentation, and translating leadership language into something workable. No one asked whether I thought the change made sense. They assumed I would make it make sense. There was a particular afternoon when my boss dropped a new responsibility onto my plate during a hallway conversation. No context, no timeline adjustment. Can you take this on too? He asked, already half turned away. I nodded automatically. Later that evening, I sat at my desk long after the office had emptied, finishing work that technically belonged to someone else. The building was quiet in a way that made your thoughts louder. That was the first time I felt tired in a different way. Not physically, not even mentally. I felt reduced, as if my role had narrowed without anyone telling me, as if my capacity to think, to shape, to decide had been quietly deprioritized in favor of my ability to execute. Still, I said nothing, because speaking up would have required explaining something that felt too intangible. How do you articulate erosion? How do you point to a pattern that looks reasonable from the outside? So I adapted. I answered emails faster. I preempted problems before they surfaced. I became even more efficient, hoping, somewhere, subconsciously, that excellence would force recognition. But efficiency without visibility doesn't elevate you. It stabilizes the system that overlooks you. I watched newer hires get introduced with enthusiasm. Their ideas were encouraged, even when unpolished. They were invited into conversations I'd never been part of. I told myself it was because they were fresh, because leadership wanted innovation. What I didn't admit was that I had been categorized. I was no longer potential. I was continuous. And continuity is rarely protected. The more I normalized these dynamics, the more they solidified. My boss began assuming my agreement before asking. He would say things like, Martha will handle that, in rooms I wasn't in. I'd find out afterward, through calendar invites and forwarded threads. When I gently pushed back once, just once, asking for context on a decision that directly affected my workload, he looked surprised, not angry, confused, as if the question itself had broken an unspoken contract. Is that an issue? He asked, genuinely puzzled. I hesitated, then shook my head. No, just wanted to understand. He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. That moment taught me something important. Not about him, but about me. I had trained them to expect compliance wrapped in competence. I had made it safe to assume I would adapt. I had mistaken being easy to work with for being respected. And now, undoing that impression would require more than a conversation. So I went quiet again. But this time, the silence felt different, heavier, more deliberate, less like avoidance and more like assessment. I began to pay attention, not just to what was said, but to what was never asked of me, to the decisions I was excluded from, the way my name functioned more like a verb than a voice. Give it to Martha. Ask Martha. Let Martha handle it. Handle, fix, cover, adjust. Never decide. By normalizing the disrespect, I had helped make it invisible. And once something becomes invisible, it stops being questioned. I wasn't angry yet. I was something quieter than that. I was awake. It took time for me to understand that I wasn't being overlooked anymore. I was being managed. Not in the formal sense. No performance plans, no explicit boundaries, but in a subtler way. A role had been assigned to me, one that worked very well for everyone else. And like most roles that benefit the system, it came with expectations I was never asked to agree to. I was the stabilizer, the translator, the buffer. When leadership made decisions that landed awkwardly, I absorbed the impact. When priorities shifted without warning, I reorganized the fallout. When tensions rose between departments, I softened them with careful language and extra work. People trusted me because I made things easier, and in doing so, I made myself smaller. I began to see how predictably I was used. In meetings, my input was welcomed only after conclusions had already formed, when someone needed validation, not perspective. My presence was functional, not influential. I wasn't expected to challenge. I wasn't expected to lead. I was expected to comply gracefully. What struck me most was how unconscious it all was. No one sat down and decided this. It emerged because I never disrupted it, because I never signaled that I wanted more than what was given. The role suited my temperament, at least on the surface. I value calm. I dislike unnecessary conflict. I believe in doing work well, even when no one is watching. But somewhere along the way, those traits had been mistaken for consent. There was a moment, small but clarifying, when a junior colleague asked me for advice about how to get noticed. She spoke about visibility, about advocating for herself, about positioning. She paused, then said, "You don't really do that though. You just handle things." She didn't mean it unkindly. She admired me. I could hear it in her tone. But the way she said it, "You just handle things," landed like a summary of how I was seen, not as someone shaping outcomes, as someone ensuring outcomes survive. That night, I wrote in my notebook, not plans, not complaints, just observations, patterns, names, timelines. Who was consulted? Who decided? Who executed? I didn't know why I was doing it yet. Only that something about seeing it on paper made it harder to ignore. The more I observed, the clearer the role became. I was expected to be loyal, but not ambitious, capable, but not assertive, essential, but not central. That combination creates a very specific kind of invisibility, one that feels like trust until the moment it doesn't. My boss reinforced this role without realizing it. He'd say things like, "I don't have to worry about you," or "You're low maintenance." Those phrases sound flattering until you understand their implication. Low maintenance means no one checks in. No worry means no investment. When restructuring conversations began circulating, quietly, cautiously, I noticed how easily my name was omitted. Others speculated about titles, new teams, and leadership shifts. No one speculated about me. I was assumed, and assumptions are dangerous when they go unexamined. I realized then that if change came, and it always does, I would not be defended. Not because anyone wished me harm, but because my value had been framed as adaptable, not irreplaceable. The role I'd been assigned was to stay, to endure, to support, to make everyone else look good. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What happens if the person who makes things easy stops? I didn't act on that question yet. I wasn't ready. But I stopped pretending I didn't hear it. The day everything shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment that would look significant from the outside. That's what made it decisive. It was late afternoon, and my boss had asked me to step into his office. Not urgently, casually. The kind of request that suggests a quick alignment, nothing more. I brought my notebook with me out of habit. He closed the door halfway and leaned against his desk, scrolling through something on his phone before looking up. "We need to talk about bandwidth," he said. I nodded, waiting. He explained that leadership was exploring some changes. Nothing final, just options, efficiency, scalability. He spoke in the abstract, using words that sounded thoughtful without committing to anything. Then he said it, almost offhandedly. "Look, I don't want you to take this personally, but no one here is irreplaceable, especially not in roles like yours." Roles like yours. The sentence landed cleanly. No malice, no warning. He didn't raise his voice or soften it. He said it the way someone states a policy they believe is self-evident. I felt something settle instead of flare. "Oh," I said, "just that?" He kept talking, unaware that he'd crossed a line he didn't know existed. He spoke about contingency planning, about coverage, about how the company needed to protect itself. I listened. I even asked one clarifying question. My tone didn't change. Inside, something had gone quiet. Not numb, not angry, clear. For years, I had sensed how I was perceived. That sentence confirmed it. Not as insecurity, but as fact. It stripped away the ambiguity I'd been living inside. There was no misinterpretation left to resolve. He saw my role as interchangeable, and more importantly, he felt comfortable saying that to me. That comfort told me everything. I thanked him for being transparent. I meant it. Transparency, even when it stings, is a form of respect, even if unintentional. When I left his office, the hallway felt longer than usual. I returned to my desk and opened my notebook, not to write, but to ground myself in something familiar. I didn't cry. I didn't vent. I didn't text anyone. I finished my work for the day. That evening, at home, the sentence replayed in my mind, not obsessively, but steadily, like a tone you notice only once the room goes quiet, especially not in roles like yours. It wasn't the idea that bothered me. On some level, it was true. Most roles are replaceable in theory. What stayed with me was the implication that my years of quiet contribution had not shifted me out of that category at all. I realized then that waiting for recognition was a form of hope I could no longer afford. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a clarification. And clarity demands response, not emotional, but structural. That night, I slept well. The next morning, I arrived at work the same way I always did. Same posture, same tone, same attention to detail. No one noticed anything different. But the way I listened had changed. I stopped filtering information through loyalty. I stopped assuming alignment. I began hearing decisions as data, not direction. I noticed how often my boss spoke about the team when he meant output, and the company when he meant protection from risk. I noticed how rarely he spoke about people as individuals, unless they were visible. And I understood finally that staying silent wasn't neutrality, it was participation. The shift wasn't toward anger or rebellion, it was toward responsibility to myself, to my future, to the version of me that had mistaken endurance for security. Words linger longer than expected. That sentence didn't push me to leave immediately. It did something more important. It freed me from the illusion that staying was loyalty. From that moment on, my silence wasn't a habit, it was a choice. After that conversation, nothing changed on the surface. That was intentional. I continued to do my work with the same level of care. I met deadlines. I responded promptly. I remained courteous and composed. If anything, I became easier to work with. Not because I was trying to please, but because I had stopped needing validation. Silence, once reactive, became deliberate. I no longer filled gaps in conversations that weren't meant for me. I stopped volunteering context when it wasn't requested. I answered questions precisely, without extending beyond what was asked. People interpreted this as efficiency. They mistook my restraint for acceptance. In meetings, I spoke less, but when I did, it was concise. I offered information, not interpretation. I watched how others responded when the stabilizing commentary was absent. I watched small misunderstandings surface. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to reveal how much translation I had been quietly providing. No one traced it back to me. That was the point. My boss seemed relieved, if anything. With fewer clarifying questions from me, he assumed alignment was complete. He began making faster decisions, more confidently. I let him. Silence gave me space to observe without being implicated. I began documenting, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Processes I had built, exceptions I had handled, decisions that relied on my institutional memory, not to hoard power, to understand it. I noticed how often people deferred to how Martha usually does it, without actually knowing how I did it. I noticed how my absence from certain conversations led to delays that were attributed to growing pains or process issues. No one considered that a person had been smoothing those edges before. I stopped correcting misattributions. That wasn't passive aggressive, it was accurate. I had not been asked. At first, it felt uncomfortable. There's a reflex to rescue, to step in and prevent inefficiency. But I reminded myself, if my role was truly replaceable, then the system should adapt without me. That's what replaceable means. I didn't withhold information. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply stopped preempting problems that no one had acknowledged as my responsibility. The difference between silence as avoidance and silence as choice is intention. I was no longer quiet because I believed speaking up would cost me. I was quiet because I was gathering information, and information I was learning was leverage, not in a manipulative sense, but in a grounding one. It showed me exactly where I stood and how fragile the assumptions around my role really were. Colleagues began filling the space I'd left. Some did it awkwardly, some confidently. A few asked me privately, "Have you noticed things feel different. I smiled and said, transitions take time. That was true. What I didn't say was that I was transitioning internally, from participant to observer. I noticed my boss stopped asking for my opinion altogether. He assumed it. That assumption gave me something invaluable: freedom from expectation. When you're no longer expected to contribute beyond execution, you gain clarity about what your presence actually enables. And I began to see something else. Without my constant translation, leadership decisions sounded harsher when delivered directly. Without my smoothing language, timelines felt tighter. Without my quiet adjustments, small cracks stayed visible longer. Still, no one named it. Silence has a way of amplifying whatever others are unwilling to say. I wasn't waiting for them to notice me. I was noticing them. The dynamic had shifted, but not in a way that raised alarms. From the outside, I was still compliant, still reliable, still there. Internally, I was recalibrating my sense of responsibility. I was no longer carrying weight that hadn't been acknowledged. I was no longer investing energy in places that saw me as interchangeable. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. I had accepted their framing and decided what to do with it. Because if I were replaceable, then staying silent while I prepared to be replaced was not betrayal. It was logical. What they never noticed was how much of the company lived outside official documents, not in secrets or scandals, but in habits, in shortcuts, in unspoken agreements, in the quiet ways things were done because someone understood how they worked. That someone had been me. As my silence continued, I began to see the organization the way you see a building after you stop maintaining it, not collapsing, but revealing stress points, dependencies, assumptions stacked on assumptions. And I began preparing, not emotionally, but methodically. I started by mapping everything I touched in a given week, not tasks, systems, where information originated, where it stalled, who relied on whom, which processes existed only because I had stitched them together over time. I was careful not to dramatize my own importance. I didn't inflate my role, I just documented facts. There were client relationships where I was the only person who knew the full history, why certain promises had been made, which expectations were flexible, which were not. There were internal tools I had configured and reconfigured so many times that the logic lived mostly in my head. There were workflows that technically belonged to a team, but in practice were routed through me because no one else knew how to resolve edge cases. None of this was formal authority. That's why it was invisible. I noticed how often people asked, "Do you remember why we decided that?" And how often the answer was, "Martha might know." But memory, unlike position, isn't protected. I began organizing my notes, not to hide them, but to see them clearly. I dated entries. I traced dependencies. I flagged risks that had been mitigated quietly in the past. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was preparation for the truth. At the same time, I began learning quietly outside my role, not during work hours, not using company resources. I updated skills I'd let stagnate because my job hadn't required them. I followed industry shifts I'd previously ignored because I was too busy keeping things running. The more I learned, the more I realized how narrow my professional world had become. Not because of my ability, but because of my role. And roles, once internalized, shape what you think is possible. I also paid attention to how my boss behaved when things went wrong, whom he blamed, who he protected, who he leaned on. Patterns emerged. He relied on visibility, not substance. He trusted people who spoke confidently, not those who stayed quiet. He assumed that what he saw was what mattered. That assumption had protected me from scrutiny for years. Now, it protects my preparation. I never stopped being professional. I never broke trust. I never shared internal concerns externally. I simply stopped acting as the company's memory buffer. When someone asked me to recall context, I answered accurately, but briefly. When someone misunderstood a process, I clarified only what was necessary. I no longer layered in safeguards they hadn't requested. People began building their own understanding, often incomplete. Again, no one noticed. Why would they? The system still worked, mostly. What they didn't see was that the system was no longer being reinforced in advance. It was being allowed to reveal itself. In the evenings, I reviewed my notes and asked myself hard questions. If I left tomorrow, what would break immediately? What would degrade slowly? What would be attributed to transition challenges rather than loss? The answers surprised me, not because I was indispensable, but because so much had been structured around my consistency rather than shared knowledge. That wasn't power in the dramatic sense. It was leverage born of neglect. And I felt no satisfaction in discovering it, only responsibility. Because leverage can be used destructively or cleanly. I had no interest in chaos. I wanted alignment between how I was seen and how I chose to act. The more I prepared, the calmer I became. There was a quiet relief in understanding my position without embellishment, in knowing that whatever happened next wouldn't be impulsive. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was building options. One afternoon, my boss remarked, "Things have been running smoothly lately." I nodded. They always did, right up until the moment they didn't. What they never noticed was that I wasn't preparing to prove my worth. I was preparing to remove myself from a story that had already decided I didn't have any. And once you see that clearly, preparation stops feeling like fear. It starts feeling like self-respect. The reveal didn't come from a conversation. It came from a pattern. One evening, as I was reviewing my notes, I realized that nearly every critical escalation over the past 3 years had passed through me before being resolved. Not because I held authority, but because I held context. I understood which constraints were real, which were flexible, and which existed only because no one had revisited them. That realization was sobering, not empowering in the cinematic sense, just clarifying. I wasn't central by design. I was central by default, and defaults are fragile. I decided to test an assumption quietly. The next time a familiar issue surfaced, one I would normally intercept before it reached leadership, I didn't intervene early. I didn't ignore it. I simply let it follow the formal path it was supposed to take. It took 3 days longer to resolve. Two people got frustrated. A minor client concern escalated unnecessarily. No one blamed me. No one even realized I'd been involved before. That was the reveal. My value had never been visible enough to be missed, only felt indirectly when absent. And indirect impact is easy to misattribute. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt precise. This wasn't about being indispensable. It was about understanding how easily the system would rewrite the narrative if I left. How quickly my contributions would be reframed as process issues or learning curves. That knowledge mattered because it stripped away the fantasy of being remembered. If I stayed, I would remain useful but unseen. If I left, my absence would be rationalized. Either way, I would not be centered. That clarity ended my internal debate. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires the hope that someone will change. I had moved past that. What I felt instead was resolve. I reviewed my finances carefully, not with panic, with realism. I noted what I could afford, how long I could afford it, and what adjustments would be required. I didn't assume best case scenarios. I planned for neutral ones. I updated my resume, not as a plea for validation, but as an inventory of facts. I resisted the urge to soften or dramatize. I wrote exactly what I had done, not what I wished had been recognized. Seeing it laid out was another reveal. On paper, my role was far larger than my title suggested. Outside the company's narrative, it had weight. I also examined my loyalty honestly. I had given years of steady contribution without complaint. I had protected the company's image, absorbed risk, and smoothed transitions. I had done that willingly. But loyalty, I realized, is not an infinite resource. It's an agreement. And the agreement had changed without my consent. The most private part of the reveal wasn't about leverage or preparation. It was about permission. I gave myself permission to stop waiting, not waiting for recognition, not waiting for fairness, not waiting for a different version of leadership. Waiting, I finally understood, was a decision, and it was no longer mine. I began exploring opportunities quietly, not desperately. Conversations, not applications. Listening more than selling. Asking questions about culture, not compensation. What surprised me was how often people responded to my calm certainty. I wasn't trying to impress. I was trying to understand whether there was alignment. And for the first time in years, I felt spacious. The job I held had shrunk my sense of time. Everything was urgent. Everything required an immediate response. Stepping outside that rhythm reminded me that urgency is often manufactured. I still showed up at work every day. I still did my job, but I no longer brought my whole self with me. I brought exactly what was required. The reveal was private because it had to be. No one needed to know what I'd seen. Not yet. Announcing clarity too early only invites interference. I didn't owe them a warning. They had already told me what they believed. I was replaceable. I accepted that fully and began acting accordingly. There's a moment, quiet, internal, when preparation stops being theoretical, when options become real. For me, that moment arrived on an unremarkable morning, standing in my kitchen, holding a mug I'd already forgotten to drink from. My calendar was full that day. Meetings stacked neatly, tasks color coded. From the outside, it looked like commitment. Inside, it felt like closure. I had three options, and I knew them all clearly. The first was to stay and renegotiate my role, ask for recognition, advocate for influence, correct the narrative that had settled around me. It would require vulnerability, political capital, and the willingness to be seen as difficult by people who had grown comfortable with my compliance. The second was to stay and disengage further, do only what is required, protect my energy, let the role shrink to match how it was valued. This option promised safety, not dignity. The third option was to leave, not impulsively, not dramatically, cleanly. Each option had a cost. What mattered was which cost I was willing to pay. I considered the first option carefully. I imagined the conversation, me outlining my contributions, reframing my role, asking to be included. I imagined my boss's response, not defensive, not cruel, just constrained. Because the problem wasn't a misunderstanding, it was structured. I realized then that asking to be seen differently would require them to admit they had benefited from not seeing me at all. And systems rarely confess that voluntarily. The second option tempted me briefly. There's relief in lowering expectations in order to survive. I could have stayed for years like that, efficient, detached, quietly resentful. But resentment has a way of leaking. It would have changed me in ways I didn't want. So I turned to the third option. Leaving meant uncertainty. It meant stepping out of a system I understood intimately into one I didn't. It meant relinquishing control in exchange for alignment. But it also meant honesty. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing here ever changed, would I be proud of how I stayed? The answer was no. That was the decision point. Not when I chose to leave, but when I chose not to negotiate my worth with people who had already categorized it. I didn't make the decision emotionally. I made it structurally. I looked at timelines. I chose a window that minimized disruption. Not for them, but for me. I considered what knowledge needed to be documented, what transitions would be required, and what boundaries I would hold. I didn't plan a speech. I planned an exit. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. There was apprehension, yes, but it was clean, focused, not the anxious static I'd felt before. Fear had lived in the ambiguity. Clarity displaced it. In the days that followed, I moved with quiet intention. I closed loops. I documented processes more thoroughly than ever, not out of obligation, but out of integrity. I made sure my departure would not be framed as sabotage or negligence. Not because I owed them comfort, because I wanted no loose ends tying me back. I didn't tell anyone yet. Not colleagues, not my boss. This wasn't secrecy, it was containment. I needed the decision to settle fully inside me before it entered the room. One afternoon, my boss stopped by my desk and said, "I'm glad you're here. Things would be chaos without you." He smiled when he said it. I smiled back. For the first time, the statement didn't land as affirmation or dismissal. It landed as confirmation. I knew then that I was ready. The irreversible choice wasn't quitting. I chose myself without asking for permission. And once that choice is made, everything else becomes execution. Once the decision was made, I didn't rush. Urgency was no longer mine. I moved the way I always had, quietly, deliberately, with attention to detail. But now, every action had direction. This phase wasn't about courage, it was about discipline. The first thing I did was separate emotion from logistics. I reviewed my contract, my benefits, and my notice period. I didn't skim. I read every line. I noted what was owed to me and what wasn't. I made sure there would be no ambiguity when the time came. I backed up personal files, removed private notes from shared spaces, and organized documentation in a way that reflected reality, not heroics. I didn't annotate my value. I simply ensured continuity where it was appropriate. At the same time, I finalized conversations outside the company, not promises, understandings, a role that aligned with how I actually worked. A culture that valued context as much as confidence. Nothing was signed yet. I wasn't leaving for something. I was leaving for something. That distinction mattered. At work, I remained exactly as expected. I didn't disengage prematurely. I didn't withhold cooperation. I attended meetings, responded to requests, and maintained professionalism. Moving in silence isn't about deception. It's about avoiding unnecessary interference. I noticed how often people confuse transparency with oversharing, how quickly intentions become negotiated once they're exposed too early. I wasn't asking for counteroffers. I wasn't seeking reassurance. I wasn't inviting persuasion. So I said nothing. The days passed smoothly, too smoothly, without realizing it. People had grown dependent on the assumption that I would always be there. That assumption made them careless, not in action, but in attention. They didn't check in, they didn't ask questions, they didn't sense the shift. My boss, especially, seemed relaxed. With quarterly targets in view and no visible fires, he focused outward. Strategy, visibility, growth. I handled the present. One afternoon, I drafted my resignation letter, not as an act of rebellion, but as a record. Short, factual, gracious, no grievances, no explanations beyond what was necessary. I didn't save it on my work computer. I saved it at home. I also rehearsed the conversation, not to script it, but to understand my own tone. Calm, direct, unemotional. I wanted no ambiguity, no escalation. I knew that how I left would shape how the story was told afterward. And I wanted that story to be boring. There's power in being uninteresting to gossip. The closer I got to the moment, the more I noticed something unexpected. Relief, not excitement, not triumph. Relief at no longer carrying the unspoken weight of staying somewhere I had outgrown quietly. Relief at not having to pretend that being low maintenance was a virtue rather than a convenience. I still cared about the work. I still respected many of the people. But I had stepped out of the role they had written for me. And they didn't know it yet. In my final week before notice, my boss asked me to take on a long-term initiative. 6 months at least. He spoke about it casually, as if my future were already accounted for. I listened. I nodded. I'll think about it, I said. That pause, so small, felt enormous. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving without consequence. It means choosing when the consequence arrives. I had chosen. All that remained was timing. The consequences didn't begin with my resignation. They began before that, with absence, not the obvious kind. I was still there every day, still present, still responsive. But the invisible scaffolding I had once provided was gone. Small delays started surfacing. Questions that used to be answered intuitively now require meetings. Meetings produced follow-ups. Follow-ups produced confusion. No one panicked. They labeled it growing complexity. I watched this with a kind of detached clarity. Not satisfaction, just confirmation. Systems rarely notice what stabilizes them until it's removed. The first real consequence showed up in a client call I wasn't invited to. A client raised a concern about a process I had quietly modified months earlier to prevent exactly this issue. Without me there, the explanation was clumsy, defensive, incomplete. The client didn't escalate. They didn't complain formally. They hesitated. Hesitation is often the first warning. Later, my boss asked me, casually, if I knew anything about the confusion. I explained the context calmly, without editorializing. I didn't say, this is why I used to handle it. I simply clarified what had happened. He nodded, slightly distracted. Let's circle back on that, he said. We didn't. Other moments followed. A report went out with an error I would normally catch. A cross-team handoff missed a step. A timeline slipped because an assumption went unchallenged. Each issue was minor, manageable, easily attributed to busyness. But together, they formed a pattern. Still, no one connected it to me. That's the thing about indirect value. It dissolves into noise when it's gone. Then came the meeting, a routine leadership sync where metrics were reviewed and efficiency was discussed. I wasn't a regular attendee, but I was asked to join that day to answer a few questions. As the conversation unfolded, I realized they were describing problems I had once preempted entirely. They spoke about them as if they were new, unexpected. I answered questions factually, briefly. At one point, my boss frowned at the data and said, "This used to run smoother." He looked around the table, puzzled. No one answered. I didn't either. Not because I wanted them to struggle, but because the observation wasn't a question. It was a realization trying to form. After the meeting, a colleague stopped me in the hallway. "Have you changed how you're working?" she asked, half joking. I met her gaze and said, "I'm working within scope." She nodded slowly. That was the first time someone sensed the shift without naming it. The consequences continued to unfold quietly, not as a crisis, but as friction, the kind that erodes confidence over time. My boss became more involved in the details he'd previously ignored. He asked more questions. He double checked things, not with suspicion, with uncertainty. I could see it in his posture. The system he trusted was behaving differently, and he didn't know why. Still, he didn't look at me. Because people don't look for absence in places they believe are stable. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been told I was replaceable. And yet, the system was struggling to replace what it had never acknowledged. But this wasn't vindication. It was inevitable. I continued moving forward with my plan. I finalized paperwork. I chose a date. I informed no one. I wanted the consequences to be visible before the cause was revealed, not as punishment, as context. By the time I handed in my notice, the environment had already changed. Subtly, uneasily. They just didn't know why yet. And when they did, it would be too late to pretend it had never mattered. I gave my notice on a Monday morning. No preamble, no build up. I asked my boss if he had a few minutes. He waved me in, distracted, still half in his inbox. I closed the door gently and handed him the letter. He skimmed it once, then again. His expression didn't shift dramatically. It tightened, just enough to register surprise. "You're leaving?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He leaned back in his chair, processing. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just unplanned. "Can I ask why?" he said finally. I had expected the question. I had prepared an answer that was honest without being accusatory. "I'm looking for alignment," I said. "In scope, in impact, in how my work is valued." He nodded slowly, as if that made sense, but not fully. "We can talk about that," he said quickly. "If this is about bandwidth or recognition, we can adjust things." That was the moment I knew it was too late. Not because he was wrong to offer, but because the offer came only after the loss became real. I didn't say that out loud. "I appreciate that," I said, "but my decision is made." He frowned, not in anger, but in confusion. "You're one of our most reliable people," he said. "This feels sudden." It wasn't sudden. It was simply no longer invisible. Over the next few days, the shift was immediate. Conversations that had once been casual became urgent. My calendar is filled with meetings labeled transition and knowledge transfer. People asked questions they'd never asked before. How does this actually work? Why is this set up that way? What happens if? I answered calmly, thoroughly. I shared what was documented and clarified what wasn't. What I didn't do was compress years of judgment into bullet points. Some things can't be transferred quickly, not because they're secrets, but because they were never meant to live in one person's head. My boss tried again midweek. Is there anything we can do to make you stay? He asked, more directly this time. I looked at him and answered honestly, not now. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. I could see the calculus shifting. Replacements, redistributions, explanations upward. Panic didn't show up as an emotion. It showed up as logistics. He began looping in people who had never been involved in my work before. Senior leaders asked for summaries. My role was suddenly visible, on paper at least. But visibility under pressure feels very different from recognition earned over time. Colleagues expressed surprise. Some were supportive. A few were unsettled. I didn't realize how much you handled, one said quietly. I nodded. Neither of us said more. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative tried to adjust. It's just timing. She was ready for a change. We'll redistribute. All true and all incomplete. No one said we underestimated her, because that would require discomfort. By the final week, the atmosphere had changed. Not hostile, just strained. My absence was being rehearsed in real time, and the results were uneven. Deadlines were renegotiated. Expectations lowered. No one admitted it aloud, but the system was bracing. My boss walked me to the elevator on my last day. We stood in silence for a moment. I didn't see this coming, he said. I know, I replied. That was the closest we came to the truth. Fixing things would have required noticing them earlier, listening differently, valuing contribution before loss. Now, the best they could do was adapt. And adaptation, when forced, always costs more. The doors closed. I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing left to fix. The confrontation everyone expected never really happened. There was no raised voice, no emotional speech, no moment where I listed grievances or demanded acknowledgement. What did happen was quieter, and in some ways, harder to dismiss. It took place 2 days before my last day. My boss asked if we could talk again. His tone was different this time, more measured, less procedural. We sat in the same office where he'd once told me I was replaceable. He didn't lean against the desk this time. He sat. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. About alignment. I nodded, inviting him to continue. I don't think I realized how much you were carrying, he said. Not intentionally. It just happened. That was the closest he came to an admission. I didn't interrupt. I want to be clear, he added. I never meant to make you feel undervalued. I believed him. Intent matters, but it doesn't negate impact. I know, I said. And I don't think anyone set out to create this dynamic. He exhaled, relieved by the absence of accusation. So where did it go wrong? He asked. The question was genuine, not defensive. I chose my words carefully, not to protect him, but to reflect reality. It didn't go wrong all at once, I said. It settled, over time, through assumptions. He listened. I became someone who handled things quietly. That worked, until it didn't. And when I realized that my role was defined without my input, I understood that staying would mean accepting that definition. He was silent for a moment. When I said what I said, he finally admitted. About being replaceable, I didn't realize how it would land. I know, I said again. But that sentence clarified things for me. I didn't say it hurt. I didn't say it stayed with me. I didn't need to. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Is there anything you'd want me to do differently? He asked. The question surprised me. Not because it was asked, but because it came too late to change my answer. Yes, I said, earlier. He smiled faintly. Not amused, aware. I suppose that's fair, he said. There was no tension in the room, no defensiveness, just the quiet acknowledgement of misalignment. I hope wherever you go next, he added, they see what we missed. I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't need it. I hope you build systems that don't depend on invisibility, I replied. For anyone. That was the closest I came to a boundary. We stood. He extended his hand. I shook it. No apology was demanded. No forgiveness was requested. Some conversations aren't about resolution, they're about clarity. As I left the office, I felt something release. Not vindication, but completion. The need to be understood had dissolved. I didn't require him to fully grasp my experience. I only needed to stop carrying it with me. That's the quiet power of a confrontation without heat. It doesn't burn, it illuminates. Leaving that job didn't transform me overnight. There was no sudden reinvention, no dramatic before and after moment where everything snapped into focus. What changed was subtler and far more durable. I stopped confusing silence with humility. In my new role, I arrived without armor. I didn't over explain, but I didn't shrink either. I asked questions early. I stated boundaries without apology. When something felt misaligned, I named it. Not emotionally, but clearly. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. It turns out that when you carry your value quietly but visibly, people adjust. Not because they're kinder, but because clarity invites respect. I no longer wait to be interpreted. I articulate. That doesn't mean I'm louder. If anything, I speak less. But when I do, it's with intention. I don't fill space that isn't mine, and I don't disappear from space that is. The part of me that once absorbed tension has learned to redirect it, not onto others, but back to the system that created it. I ask whether something makes sense before I ask whether I can handle it. That shift alone has changed everything. I still value calm. I still dislike unnecessary conflict. But I've learned that peace maintained through self erasure isn't peace, it's a postponement. Who I am now is someone who notices earlier, someone who pays attention not just to what's being said, but to what's being assumed. Someone who understands that roles are often assigned in the absence of boundaries, and that boundaries, when stated early, prevent resentment later. I no longer pride myself on being low maintenance. I value being well aligned. There are moments when old habits resurface, when I feel the urge to smooth something over or take on more than I should. But now, that impulse triggers a pause instead of action. I ask myself a question I once avoided. Is this mine? If the answer is no, I let it remain unsolved a little longer. Not to be difficult, but to let responsibility land where it belongs. What I've gained isn't dominance in the traditional sense. I don't command rooms or assert control. What I've gained is internal authority, the ability to choose how and where my energy is invested. And that has made me quieter, not louder, calmer, not sharper, more precise. I think often about that sentence, you're replaceable, and how differently I hear it now. Not as a threat, not as an insult, as information. It told me where I stood, and that allowed me to decide where I wouldn't stay. I don't carry bitterness from that experience. Bitterness requires fixation. I carry discernment, and discernment has changed the way I move through every room I enter. I don't need to be seen by everyone. I only need to be seen accurately. There's a lesson people often want from stories like this. A neat moral, something sharp and declarative. Always speak up. Never stay too long. know your worth. Those phrases sound right, they're just incomplete. What this experience taught me wasn't how to leave, it was how to listen to patterns instead of promises, to listen to how people describe you when they don't think you're negotiating, to listen to what your silence is being used for. Because silence is never empty. It either protects you or it trains others how to treat you. For a long time, mine did the latter. I don't regret the years I spent being reliable. They shaped my discipline, my patience, my ability to observe without reacting. Those qualities didn't disappear when I left. They followed me. What I regret, if anything, is not noticing sooner that I had confused endurance with integrity. Staying quiet can be a strength, but only when it's chosen. The moment silence becomes expected, it stops being neutral. When my boss told me I was replaceable, he didn't give me a wound. He gave me clarity. Words linger longer than expected. Not because they hurt, but because they reveal. That sentence revealed how my role was seen, how my contributions were framed, and how easily years of quiet labor can be collapsed into a single assumption. And once you see that clearly, you're responsible for what you do with it. Leaving wasn't about punishment or pride. It was about alignment between how I worked, how I was valued, and how I wanted to live. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need recognition after the fact. I needed honesty early enough to choose myself without resentment. If you take anything from this story, I hope it's this. Pay attention to the roles you're silently cast into. Notice whether your reliability is being respected or simply relied upon. And remember that being replaceable in someone else's system doesn't mean you are replaceable in your own life. You're allowed to step out of stories that don't make room for your full presence. Before we end, I want to leave you with a question, not to provoke, but to reflect. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough that people assumed you would always stay? And if so, what would it look like to choose differently now? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.